Good day and welcome back to the Vitality Project. I'm Dr. Bob. Really grateful for you to be here with me today. Thanks for joining me in our unfolding journey here at the Vitality Project. Yesterday, we unpacked what can be a thorny problem for many of us, and it's what we call the depressor-fixer cycle. The depressor-fixer cycle. I hope you found that our first exercise working with this cycle, I hope you found that helpful. And I do plan to come back to it, so there'll be much more to say about this cycle. But first, I want to just take a little sidetrack today to discuss something. It's an important something. I had a very helpful conversation just yesterday with a very dear professional colleague of mine. He happens to live in Australia. He and I are both personally engaged in committed long-term recovery, respectively. And also, we both work full-time in the field of addiction recovery. He is a therapist and I as a recovery coach and educator. What he and I discussed was this. Although the tools that are typically shared in addiction recovery and also here at your Vitality Project, although these individual tools may be necessary, and I think actually he and I agreed that they are necessary, there is more beyond this. There's more also that needs to be included if we're going to build a truly sturdy, reliable, and I believe sufficient response to the challenge that addiction poses for all of us. Let me say more about that. You know, alongside the biology of addiction, we just had a workshop this summer here at your Vitality Project that addressed this over a period of several hours. The biology of addiction, it's very important to understand what addiction does to our brains and bodies, and gives us a leg up in terms of how we might respond to ensure and protect our sobriety. So there's the biology of addiction. There's also the psychology of addiction. Most of you know at this point that my background is in clinical psychology. I've been in this field since started studying clinical psychology 40 years ago, actually over 40 years ago. And I've been in the field of psychology all these years in different ways. I was a university professor. I was a licensed clinical psychologist, and got addicted in midlife. And I lost my professorship and I lost my license as a psychologist, and eventually got myself into recovery. It took a while to recover from the devastation of what addiction had done to me and bad choices that I had made. In the last 10 years, I've been really committed to primarily addiction education and recovery coaching. That's what I do. And so my background in psychology of addiction is also an important key, as I understand it. It's kind of front yard for me in addressing addiction. And we just had another workshop this summer that addressed the psychology of addiction. So there's the biology and the psychology of addiction, but we must not also inadvertently forget to include what my friend and I were talking about as the relational dimension of recovery. Now, it's not that the relational dimension doesn't have anything to do with the biology of addiction, and certainly not that it has nothing to do with the psychology of addiction. My background in psychology has, a lot of it's been focused on the impact of relationships, for sure. But it's easy to miss, I think, the relational dimension if we focus too much on the individual psychology of addiction, or for that matter, the individual biology of addiction. Why, there's even a discipline now in neuroscience, it's a biological discipline, that looks at the biology of relationships. It's referred to as interpersonal neurobiology. That's a mouthful. So whether it's interpersonal neurobiology of addiction in more of a medical or biological approach, or whether we look at the impact of attachment relationships on addiction, that's really what my friend and I were talking about. In fact, somebody who's made a major point of this more recently is the British journalist Johann Hari. You may well have seen his viral TED Talk that was recently posted, where very charismatically, at the very climax of his presentation, he says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. What is it? The opposite of addiction is connection. And that's really implied in what my friend and I were talking about. So in that spirit then of connection, of the relational dimension, I'd like to ask you to ask yourself a crucial question, and this is today's homework invitation. This is the question. In the presence of whom have I been most vulnerable to addictive behaviors? It could be addiction to an addictive substance. It could be addiction to some other behavior that is compulsive, that we can't stop, that hurts us. It could be even addiction to a counterproductive or self-defeating attitude. In the presence of whom have I been most vulnerable to addictive behavior? Another way to put that is, what interpersonal relationships in my life, whether with family or other loved ones, or perhaps it's at work, or maybe it's at school, what interpersonal relationships have been most associated for me with my primary or biggest challenges to sustaining my sobriety? So we're going right into the interpersonal domain by asking these questions. What I'd like you to do is bookmark your answer here, because I definitely plan, maybe with my Australian friend alongside of me, I definitely plan to, as soon as possible, dive much more deeply into what I think of as the interpersonal matrix in all of our lives, and to view that both in terms of how it can serve as a resource, and unfortunately, sometimes how it can be an impediment to our recovery. So stay tuned for that discussion. I just wanted to punctuate where we're going right now with mind-body bridging, to let you know that we have plans to really take a deep, deep dive into analyzing and resourcing our relationships. I want to thank you again for joining me today. Hope you'll come back and join me again tomorrow. Between now and then, please stay safe, be well, and I'll see you soon.